couple of weeks ago, we had the cylinder head come in from a 172 cubic inch gasoline Ford tractor engine, but during the inspection after our cleaning, we noticed that something was off. Our magnetic particle inspection quickly revealed that at some point prior during this head's life, some major crack repairs had been completed. The repairs did look to be very professional and to our knowledge were holding, but these heads were known for cracks, and from the looks of it, this head may have just been a poor quality casting from the factory. After discussing with the customer, the decision was made to move forward with the valve job on a different head supplied by the customer, as to avoid any possible liabilities that could come if these crack repairs were to fail down the road. Luckily, the customer did have access to a spare head, which turned out to be a much better core to start with.
So on this head, you can see that 6 of the valve guides had already been pressed out. We drove those out before we baked the head and cleaned it. There were 2 guides that were pretty much super tight, didn't want to budge, so we went ahead and baked it.
We're starting off our work here by leveling up the head on the TCM25 so that we can get to work driving these last 2 seized guides out of the head. This design is somewhat unique as most press fit guides we see are only around a 1/2 inch outside diameter, whereas these guides are about 3/4 inch OD, so pretty big. Even with how beefy these guides are, when they're seized like this, our first step is to cut the top of the valve guide flush with the casting of the cylinder head. If you just keep driving on it as they sit, you're ultimately going to break the top of the guide off, or at the very least, mushroom it to where it won't go through the bore of the head without causing damage. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and check out the description for more information on our small family-owned business.
Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill partway through the guide with this 5/8 drill bit. And what that's going to do is kind of relieve some of the press fit so that we can go ahead and hopefully get them to move and drive on out. I'm not going to drill all the way through, probably just maybe a little over halfway, and that way it leaves a step that we can put this driver in and drive down against and hopefully get them to drive out.
At this point, you'll see that we have thinned out the guide to around 60 thousandths wall thickness partway down, leaving a step at the bottom to drive against with the air hammer. In a perfect world, this would get it loosened up just enough that when we drive against it, it would pop right out, but in this case, it simply busted the guide into right at the step. The one on the left moved slightly, but the upper part of the right one didn't even budge. That's okay because at this point we can take another driver, which definitely did not used to be a nice Matco 1/2 inch drive extension, and drive against the remaining shell from the opposite direction to finish removing the guides from the head, still with no damage to the bores. To make sure the bores were clean for a new valve guide, I touched them very quickly with a ball hone to take out any burrs or debris, but don't worry, we didn't do enough to remove any material and affect the press fit.
Alright, now I'm ready to get the guides pressed into this head. On the combustion side here inside the port, this face of the valve guide is about flush with the casting, and the intake ports, it's actually exposed a little bit in the port, but on the top side, they're all even. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press in my exhaust guides till they're flush here on the casting. And when I say press, it's a press fit, but we're using a driver. Then on the intake, I'm going to go in and drive them in until on the top side, they all match. I am going to be using our press fit lube like we always do. Spray a little bit on the guide, spray a little bit on the bore, and you're good to go. Those go in tough.
At this point, the exhaust guides are in to the correct height, so to get the guide height correct on the intake guides, we're going to start them in straight before setting a straight edge across the top of 2 exhaust guides and drive the intake guide until it just touches a straight edge.
So right out the gate here, we're sitting right at 2000s clearance. A lot of the aftermarket valve guides, when they come in, they're on the higher side of spec. On the intake, we're supposed to be 1 to 2 thousandths. On the exhaust, we're supposed to be 1.5 to 3. So knowing that our exhaust valve stem is about 1,000th smaller than the intake valve stem, I have this set to 0 for the intake. So if we're measuring, about 2 thousandths there on that intake, actually a few tenths above that, and on this exhaust, we're measuring 2 by what the gauge is set to, but that's really about 3 thousandths. What that's telling me is I really don't want to go any larger on the valve guides if I can help it, so I need to find a pilot that fits pretty well right here. Having driven these guides in, obviously we've checked the size, we're already on the big side, so I don't want to hone a lot of material out. I do want to go through the guides with the hone just to give them that nice finish on the inside and make sure that we don't have any burrs or any raised edges or anything like that from driving them in. So we're just going to go through and touch them up really, really quickly here. Can't feel any excess wiggle, which is exactly where I want it to be able to cut the seats just like I want them on the Surdy. So at this point, I think the 874 is a good spot. Might have to hit that hole maybe a little bit more. We'll see. I got to clean them out too, because sometimes there'll be something in there that keeps them from running good. If I put the 873 in, it also feels pretty good, but I can feel, and it's, it's something that you probably can't really see, but there's just a tiny, tiny bit of wiggle there. Again, we're probably talking, 3 or 4 10,000ths of an inch, but it's there, and that makes it that much harder to machine a good seat on the Surdy. You can do it, it just takes more skill, and you don't get as good of results as you do when you have a perfectly fit pilot.
At this point, we're going to move over to the Surdy for our valve seat work and get leveled up. You can see that the bubble level for the Surdy appears to be somewhat crude, but the mechanisms of the Surdy machine make up for any misalignments in the plumbness.
Got the head on the Surdy. I normally like to keep it a little more centered in this tilt fixture. You can see we're a little offset to the right side, which when we loosen these handles kind of makes it tip back just from the weight being off center, but we've got this little bolt right there that kind of hits depending on where I want to put it, so I think this will work good and we'll get it going and get the seats cut. At this point, I'm working on getting my intake cutter set up so that we can come in and cut the intake seats. We're using a 3-angle valve seat cutter insert. This cutter has a 45-degree seat angle as the specs call for, and it is 60 thousandths wide on the intake here. We're going 60 thousandths on the intake and 80 thousandths on the exhaust. That's right in what it calls for on the intake. That's a little narrower than it calls for on the exhaust. Again, we're just touching up the seats, so it's a battle of matching what we have to work with, as opposed to when we're putting in new seats, obviously we're setting it based on our valve and based on our other specs. So in this case, where this seat is, pretty well worn, but it's not completely worn out, if our cutter is set up too small, we're gonna have to cut very, very deep into the head to get our full seat angle to come into the valve. If we set it up too wide, we're going to end up with the seat not centered on the valve face. I've kind of done a balancing act here of setting this up and looking at where we're going to be on the valve face. Right now I've got it where I think it's going to be pretty well centered. I may end up moving out just a little bit once I start cutting, but we're going to see what it looks like.
As we start cutting here, you're going to see the bottom angle coming in first, which is what you want to see. And usually the seat angle comes in next, but in this case we see a sliver of the top angle on the right there, followed by the 45-degree seat angle coming in.
So you could probably tell there that we went from basically our bottom angle coming in to almost instantly all of our seat angle cleaned up, and we got a bunch of top angle, with the exception of this low spot over on this side. Checking where we're seating on the valve, we're right in the middle right now, so knowing that we have room to go out a little bit, I'm going to bring it out just a tiny bit more. I went 1/4 of a turn out on the cutter.
Our biggest focus when recutting seats without installing new seats is to avoid cutting the seat too deep into the head. And to do this, we just want to cut until we have our full seat width all the way around. As you can see, the SERDI operates on an airfloat, which allows the spindle head to move between each valve guide. Once the pilot is inserted into a particular guide, 2 additional airfloats are released, which allow the pilot to find the true axis and center line of the valve guide. At that point, the airfloats are locked down and everything is rigid and ready to cut the seats.
Same idea here on the exhaust cutter. I've got a 3-angle cutting insert. This time it's 80 thousandths wide. It's a 45-degree seat still, and I'm just trying to match what's already here. We got to work with what we got. We could have put seats in, but they're nice enough that we're trying to save the customer a little bit of money by not going to the extra expense of installing seats when it really doesn't need it. But that being said, we have to match what we've got. So I've got my cutter adjusted here, and we're going to see if we can cut these.
I should note that this head does already have exhaust valve seat inserts. We're simply just not installing new exhaust valve seat inserts.
I've got bottom angle on this half over here.
You might notice that despite having a freshly sharpened cutter, the seat appears what I'm going to call as draggy. As such, I sped up the RPM quite significantly in an effort to get an improved surface finish. I also tried finishing the cuts with a little bit of coolant, but even then the seats were still not visually perfect. Every once in a while, we get a head in with seats that just have some sort of material that no matter what you do, the finish doesn't look perfect. That being said, the seats do still come out well, and they do pass our quality checks in regards to holding vacuum and having acceptable runout. They just don't look as good aesthetically. With all the valve seats cut, it was time to move over to the surfacing machine, but I decided to glass bead in the water jacket of the head because after all of the hammering earlier with the guide work, we had knocked loose a ton of rust and debris that the steel shot machine hadn't fully cleaned, so I wanted to take care of that before I got the surface done. Similarly to cutting the valve seats, our goal with resurfacing the head is only to cut the necessary amount of material to get an acceptable surface again. In this case, we're looking for a decent surface finish from our CBN cutter, but more importantly, we're looking to get the head gasket surface completely flat with no low spots that could result in a head gasket leak.
I'll clean all the way across here, all the way across here, and all the way across here up till here. And then we've got this section in here that isn't cleaned up yet, so we're going to take another cut.
With one more cut for a total of around 4 thousandths off the surface, we had a flat cylinder head with a very nice surface finish. With that, the machine work on the head was finished, so we gave it a quick wash cycle in one of our spray cabinets before moving on to the assembly. After the wash cycle, we always rinse the cylinder head thoroughly with fresh water, being sure to finish rinsing any debris out of any ports, passages, and bolt holes. Finally, the head gets blown completely dry, which again helps to ensure that no debris is left in any part of the head. When it leaves our shop, we want the head to be perfectly clean, just like it would have been when it left the Ford factory. Finally, we're on to the final assembly of the cylinder head with all new valves, springs, keepers, and valve stem seals, but we are reusing the spring retainers. Each valve will be installed into the cylinder head with assembly lubricant on the valve stem to help lubricate the valve stems on the initial startup of the engine. I'll also note that the intake valves do have umbrella-style valve stem seals, which literally act as an umbrella to keep oil from simply pouring down the valve guide. This head also utilizes two different valve keeper designs, one for the intake and one for the exhaust. The exhaust keepers are kind of tough, but overall it's a pretty straightforward assembly. There was also one freeze plug that had to be installed in the end of the head, so I gave the bore a band of Loctite before getting an appropriately sized driver and driving the freeze plug into the head. All in all, this was a pretty straightforward and fun valve job to get an old Ford tractor back in the field, or just in a parade, I'm really not sure. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and be sure to check out www.jamsyonline.com for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.